Port Reliance, Alaska. The name itself felt like a scar on my soul, a wound I'd spent more than a decade trying to close. I was Captain Anya Petrova, United States Army, JAG Corps, and at 32 years old, I'd faced down combat zones and courtrooms that would make lesser men, and certainly lesser women, buckle. Yet, as my rental SUV crunched over the icy gravel of Main Street, a street that had once been the entirety of my world, the old anxieties crawled out of the shadows. The air, crisp and biting, was a familiar enemy, carrying the scent of pine and the ghosts of my past. It was just before noon, the sun barely climbing above the low, brooding peaks, casting long, frigid shadows. I'd seen colder, yes, in the Hindu Kush, or during winter exercises in the Rockies, but none had felt quite so personal. My uniform, impeccably pressed, felt like both armor and a target. It represented everything I had fought for: purpose, discipline, a life beyond the confines of this isolated town. The silver bars on my shoulders, the insignia of the Judge Advocate General's Corps, they were my shield and my weapon. But as I pushed open the heavy, oak door of Miller and Associates, attorneys at law, all that hardened resolve felt thin, fragile. The office was a museum of forgotten time, a dusty mausoleum of small-town disputes. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper, stale coffee, and something else, a pervasive silence that hummed with unspoken tension. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a storm, a stillness that had defined so many moments of my childhood. Immediately, the temperature in the room felt like it dropped a dozen degrees, not because of the Alaskan cold seeping in, but because the ghosts of my 19-year-old self, the discarded daughter, had risen to greet me. My mother, Svetlana, sat rigidly, her back ramrod straight, a posture I knew intimately. Her eyes, usually pools of icy blue, were narrowed, focused with laser precision on the local attorney, a portly man named Miller whose face was already flushed with the uncomfortable heat of a family drama he likely wished he wasn't witnessing. She didn't look at me, not directly, but I felt her presence like a physical blow. Her voice, when it came, was a razor-sharp whisper, slicing through the heavy air. "Anya, don't disgrace us. Sit still and keep silent." The words were a practiced litany, a familiar echo from countless forgotten arguments in our small, suffocating home. My father, Ivan, was equally effective in his dismissal. He didn't even bother to glance my way, his gaze fixed on Mr. Miller as if I were merely a shadow that had momentarily crossed the threshold. For them, the uniform I wore wasn't a symbol of service, of sacrifice, of the blood and sweat I'd poured into becoming a woman they would never understand. No. For them, it was proof of my ultimate rebellion, a stark admission of my failure to conform to their expectations. It was a visible accusation, a living embodiment of the daughter who had dared to carve out her own path, far from their stifling grip. They didn't know that this uniform, this structured life, had given me a purpose beyond the one they had dictated. They didn't know that law school, years of demanding study and relentless self-reinvention, had given me a weapon sharper than any they could wield. They thought they had summoned me here, to this antiquated office, to witness their power, to be reminded of my place, to perhaps even be shamed into compliance. They thought I was merely an inconvenient presence, a necessary evil for some obscure legal formality. What they didn't realize, as the heavy silence stretched on, broken only by the nervous shuffling of papers by Mr. Miller, was that they hadn't just summoned their daughter. They had just summoned the very judge who would, in due time, render a verdict on them, and I intended to do so, without an ounce of my past self's hesitation, no matter the cost. The drive from Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson to Port Reliance always felt longer than the miles suggested. It wasn't the scenery, the familiar Alaskan landscape, stark and beautiful, rolling out beneath a sky that could shift from brilliant sapphire to bruised violet in the span of an hour. It was the destination. Port Reliance, the town where I'd grown up, now felt like a foreign country, governed by rules I'd long since outgrown, or perhaps, was never meant to follow. My chest felt tight, a familiar constriction that had nothing to do with the altitude and everything to do with the gravitational pull of family obligation. I had taken a military transport, then rented a beat-up sedan, the kind of car that blended seamlessly into the backdrop of any small American town, far removed from the armored vehicles and roaring jets I was accustomed to. I kept my service uniform on, a silent defiance, a shield. It was a part of me now, a second skin, each crease and patch a story, each metal a memory etched in blood and valor. But as I stepped out of the car, the crisp chill of the Alaskan air offering little solace, the shield felt flimsy. The local lawyer's office, a squat building nestled between a bait shop and a diner that served the best greasy burgers north of Anchorage, loomed. Its interior, I knew, was worse, a space deliberately designed to make you feel small. Dark, paneled walls absorbed the light, heavy drapes swallowed any hint of the outside world, and an atmosphere thick with unspoken judgment seemed to cling to the very fabric of the worn leather chairs. This was familiar territory. Yes, but not in any context I welcomed. Not as a returning soldier, not as Anya Volkov, but as an unwilling participant in my own family's theater of war. My parents were already inside, waiting just past the heavy oak door. They stood like two statues carved from cold disapproval, perfectly posed. There was no warmth, no customary embrace, not even a perfunctory "so good to see you, Anya. How was your flight?" Instead, my mother, Svetlana's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, did a swift, almost imperceptible scan of my uniform. The crisp, ironed jacket, the gleaming badges, she took it all in, not with pride, but with a subtle tightening of her lips, that familiar, thin line of disappointment I'd known since I was old enough to defy her. It was a look that said, "You're trying too hard, or why can't you just be less?" My father, Ivan, offered only a curt nod, his gaze already sweeping the room, assessing the audience as he always did. He was ensuring their carefully constructed facade of wealth and respectability was perfectly intact, a general surveying his troops, every detail serving the greater narrative of their unwavering success. The performance had begun. "Sit in the back," Svetlana whispered, her voice a low hiss, laced with that old, familiar shame that seemed to cling to her like expensive, suffocating perfume. She gave a slight flick of her wrist toward a plain wooden chair, tucked away in a corner near the entrance. By the door. "At least try to look normal." The words, "try to look normal," hit me like a physical blow, a concussive force to my gut. It was the story of my entire childhood, a finely honed dagger she'd sharpened over years, telling me I was too loud, too fierce, too much, never quite fitting into the elegant, delicate mold she'd envisioned. I remember once, when I was perhaps 10 years old, I'd come home from an afternoon exploring the woods behind our house, scraped knees and mud on my face, exhilarated by the wildness of it all. She'd looked at me then, not with concern for my injuries, but with that same thin-lipped disapproval, murmuring, "Anya, must you always be so unkempt? Try to look normal, darling." Normal to her meant quiet, compliant, decorative. Normal, to me, meant invisible. The irony was a suffocating weight pressing down on my lungs. Here I stood, an officer in the United States Army, a pilot, a symbol of discipline, precision, and honor, a woman who had faced down actual enemies and brought her crew home through hails of enemy fire. Yet, in this room, in front of my own blood, I was reduced to a problematic teenager, an embarrassment to be tucked away. They were trying to hide the perceived injustice of my very existence, a sensation I knew as intimately as my own heartbeat, coiling hot and tight in my gut, ready to ignite. I didn't utter a word. To speak would be to engage. To engage would be to acknowledge the validity of their petty disdain. Instead, I just gave a precise, military nod, a gesture that conveyed both understanding and a profound, internal refusal to crumble. My back was ramrod straight, my movements controlled, every step a testament to the training that had forged me into the soldier I was today. I was a soldier, and I knew how to follow orders, even one that felt like a direct, personal assault. As I settled into the hard wooden chair, the cheap fabrics scraping against my uniform, the scent of old paper, polished wood, and stale coffee filled my nostrils. It was a stark, almost absurd contrast to the dust and diesel of the base, the metallic tang of fear and adrenaline from a combat zone. My gaze drifted. Beyond my parents, a few other faces were scattered amongst the dark leather chairs, Uncle Nikolai, grim-faced, his usual booming laugh, which could shake the very foundations of their grand estate. Conspicuously absent, Aunt Elena, perpetually clutching a designer handbag, her eyes darting nervously between my parents and me, always fearful of any ripple in the family's carefully curated calm. They were all members of the Volkov court, orbiting my parents' power, their presence here signifying the gravity of whatever performance was about to unfold. But then there was the man I hadn't expected to see. Not here, not now. His presence was a jagged rock in the smooth pond of family pretense. He sat at the head of the long, gleaming conference table, directly opposite the lawyer, Mr. Abernathy. There was a quiet, almost predatory authority in his posture, even though he hadn't uttered a single sound. His hair was streaked with silver at the temples, a distinguished touch to a face that held the lines of countless strategic victories. His suit, dark and impeccably tailored, whispered of understated power, far beyond the gaudy displays my father favored. This wasn't family in the traditional sense, but his presence was a clear signal of the true, immense weight behind this meeting. Elias Thorne. The name alone was a currency in corporate circles, a whisper of immense influence and ruthless efficiency. He was a corporate titan, a man whose decisions could reshape entire industries, not merely settle a family dispute over inherited land or old grudges. Why was he here? What interest did a man of his stature have in the internal squabbles of the Volkovs? A cold dread, sharper and more pervasive than any Alaskan winter, seeped into my veins. This wasn't just about my family's drama. This was about something far larger, something truly dangerous, something that hinted at a game I wasn't even aware I was playing. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat, a dry, almost apologetic sound, adjusting his thick-rimmed glasses. The air in the room crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with legal proceedings and everything to do with unspoken resentments and the heavy, burdensome legacy of the Volkov name. I watched Thorne, his profile sharp and unreadable against the weak light from the window, his gaze fixed on my father. A strange, knowing glint passed between them, a silent communication that sent a shiver down my spine. My hand instinctively went to my side, where I usually carried my service pistol, finding only the smooth, unyielding fabric of my uniform. I was unarmed, metaphorically and literally, facing a threat I hadn't anticipated, a battle I hadn't trained for. The meeting was about to begin, and I knew, with an unsettling certainty that resonated deep in my bones, that my life was about to take another unforeseen turn. This twist felt potentially more consequential, more world-altering, than even the bullet that had ripped through my side, sending me home on medical leave. The whispers of family power, once just background noise, were about to become a roaring storm, and I was caught right in its terrifying, silent eye. The storm on the sea had quieted, a familiar lull in the harsh Alaskan calendar, but the storm within me had not. That year I was 16, a tangled mess of quiet ambition and unspoken longing, and in the vast, untamed wilderness surrounding our small, remote village, only the salmon run truly mattered. It was a primal, silver promise, a brief, frenzied bounty that defined our summers, a fleeting sense of purpose in the immense, indifferent landscape. My sister, Alina, 2 years my junior, was already the radiant center of our family's universe. She possessed an innate spark, a gravitational pull that drew everyone in. Alina was everything I wasn't: effortlessly charming, openly emotional, with a laugh that could cut through the perpetual Alaskan chill, a sound like wind chimes against a clear, cold sky. She embraced life with an unrestrained joy that often left me feeling like a shadow, a muted echo in her vibrant wake. My mother, Svetlana, a woman forged from the same unyielding Alaskan rock as the landscape itself, had spent an entire weekend with Elena, a rare and precious gift of focused attention. I remember the excited chatter echoing through the thin walls of our small, drafty cabin, the rustle of new fabrics, the conspiratorial whispers. They were preparing for the village's annual salmon harvest festival, a tradition as old as the mountains themselves, a pivotal moment in our community life. They'd bought Alina a gorgeous, expensive traditional dress, hand-embroidered with intricate patterns that told stories of generations, of resilience and survival, a vibrant celebration of our heritage. It wasn't just clothing, it was an investment, a symbol of belonging, of being seen and valued within the tapestry of our people. I watched, a silent observer, feeling the familiar ache of exclusion, even as I told myself I didn't care. A few days later, the air still thick with the lingering scent of fresh pine, the distant tang of the sea carried on a gentle breeze, I found Mom in the living room. Her attention was wholly absorbed by the local paper, her brow furrowed over an article about the upcoming fishing quotas. A cup of lukewarm tea sat forgotten beside her, steam long vanished. I took a deep breath, the kind you take just before diving into the frigid depths of a glacier-fed lake, bracing for the inevitable chill. "Mom," I started, trying to keep my voice even, steady, betraying none of the hope that fluttered like a trapped bird in my chest. "Can we go dress shopping for me this weekend? For the festival, I mean." She didn't lift her head, her gaze fixed, unmoving, on the printed words. "Oh, honey, don't be silly," she said, her voice a practiced, almost automatic dismissiveness, waving me off with a flick of her wrist as if brushing away a persistent, insignificant fly. "You can wear Alina's from last year. It still looks perfectly fine. You know how quickly she grows. It would be a waste not to. Besides," she added, finally glancing up, a flicker of something I couldn't quite name, perhaps a tired affection, perhaps a resigned understanding of my nature in her eyes. "You don't care about all that frilly stuff, do you? You're my practical girl, my little scholar. You'd rather have your nose in a book than fuss over dresses, wouldn't you?" It wasn't a question, it was a statement, a gentle but firm reassertion of my place, my predetermined role. Her words were a verdict, delivered with the quiet, unquestionable authority of a lifetime of observation, of assumptions solidified into absolute truths. My desires didn't matter. My preferences had been decided for me long ago, etched into the very bedrock of our family dynamic, like ancient pictographs on a cave wall. "I don't care," I mumbled, the lie tasting like ash, acrid and bitter, on my tongue. The truth was, I did care. I cared desperately. I was the quiet, studious one, yes. I was the one who sought solace in the silent pages of books rather than the boisterous laughter of crowds, who found comfort in the predictable logic of facts over the unpredictable swirl of human emotion. And because of that, it had been decided. It was decided I wasn't worth feeling beautiful. I wasn't worth the investment of a new dress, a personal choice, a moment of individual recognition. I was the placeholder, the logical choice for a hand-me-down, the one who wouldn't make a fuss. I remember picking up the dress she meant, the pale blue, ruffled one Elena had worn a year ago, which had fit her perfectly. Alina, with her delicate frame and buoyant spirit, her hair the color of spun gold, had looked like a vision of a summer sky in it, twirling in joyous abandon. On me, it was a different story entirely, a cruel parody. It was too wide at the shoulders, the thin straps slipping down my collarbones, making me look even smaller, more awkward, swallowed by the excess fabric. It was too short at the waist, cinching in the wrong place, then flaring out haphazardly, creating an unflattering silhouette that seemed to emphasize every flaw. The fabric, once soft and cheerful on Alina, now felt cheap and alien against my skin, a borrowed identity that chafed and prickled. I stood before the small, cracked mirror in my room, a pale imitation, a ghost of someone else's joy. I was an imposter, a hand-me-down girl, feeling both utterly invisible, erased by its ill fit, and starkly, uncomfortably highlighted by its very presence, a walking testament to my second-place status. It was a uniform of my assigned role, and it felt like a silent, deeply personal betrayal. I never went to that salmon harvest festival. Not that year, not ever after. The thought of parading in borrowed finery, a living advertisement for my mother's practicality and my sister's past glamour, was unbearable. That night, while my classmates danced under the twinkling lights strung across the village square, their joyful shouts and the lilting strains of fiddle music carried on the crisp, evening air, weaving a tapestry of community and belonging, I sat in my room. The only sounds that broke the profound stillness were the distant, mournful howl of a lone wolf and the gentle, rhythmic rustle of pages turning. Under the solitary glow of a desk lamp, its weak, Yellow beam a lonely beacon against the deepening Alaskan twilight that lingered long into the night, I read a book. It wasn't about fishing, or festivals, or the comforting, constricting embrace of family traditions. It was a meticulously detailed account of the history of Alaskan native whaling, of ancient peoples battling the colossal, terrifying power of the sea, not for celebration, but for survival, for the sheer, brutal, uncompromising necessity of life in a land that offered no quarter. It was my first act of silent rebellion, a quiet, internal declaration of war against the expectations that sought to define me, to box me into a predetermined narrative. If they wouldn't let me into their world, the vibrant, celebrated world of community and tradition and pretty, new dresses, then I would build my own. And I promised myself then, under the cold, impassive Alaskan moon, its light a silver blade against the endless, inky darkness, that my world would be vast, unforgiving, and entirely my own making. It would be a fortress built of sheer will and the sharp, untamed edges of my own truth, forged not from borrowed finery or the gentle hand of tradition, but from the raw, unyielding strength I was only just beginning to discover within myself. It was the moment I stopped waiting for an invitation to someone else's party and started charting my own formidable course, even if it meant sailing alone into the vast, uncharted waters of the unknown. That decision, made in the quiet solitude of an Alaskan night, set a trajectory I would follow for decades, straight into the heart of the wild, and ultimately, into the very crucible of my own making. That quiet rebellion, a slow burn under my skin, finally ignited into a concrete plan a year later, on the day I graduated high school. I'd worked relentlessly, fueled by a stubborn refusal to be unseen, to earn that high honor diploma. A small, almost naive part of me still held onto a fragile hope that this, finally, would be enough. This they would have to acknowledge. I stood backstage, the murmur of the crowd a low hum, listening for my name, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. When Anya Petrova was announced, I walked across the stage, my eyes scanning the sea of faces, searching, always searching, for theirs. And then I saw it, 2 empty seats in the section reserved for the Petrova family. They weren't there. The smile I'd practiced for weeks, the one meant to convey effortless grace and achievement, faltered, freezing on my face. I shook the principal's hand, accepted my diploma, and walked down the stage, a cold, hard knot of bitterness tightening in my stomach. They appeared just as the ceremony was wrapping up, strolling in with casual apologies about unforeseen traffic on the single winding trail that led into our village. Their excuses felt thin, transparent, and their irritation at the inconvenience was far more palpable than any remorse for missing my moment. The celebratory dinner I'd envisioned, perhaps at a fancy seafood restaurant in Anchorage, a rare luxury, never materialized. Instead, during a rushed, tense meal at home, they made their own announcement. "We have wonderful news," my father beamed, his gaze fixed on Elena, who sat across from me, already radiating an undeserved glow. "We've decided to sponsor an Arctic white whale hunting trip for Elena as an early graduation gift." Elena shrieked with unadulterated delight, her joy echoing through the strained silence of the kitchen. I simply stared at my plate, the food turning to ashes in my mouth, the taste of betrayal a bitter tang on my tongue. My graduation, my hard-won achievement, had been not just overshadowed, but utterly erased, replaced by a lavish reward for my sister. That was the exact moment I finally understood. It wasn't that I wasn't good enough. It was that in their eyes, I simply didn't exist in the same universe as Elena. My successes were footnotes, easily overlooked. Hers were headlines, splashed across their lives. That night, the quiet rebellion that had simmered in my heart for so long officially became a declaration of war. I had to get out. The military wasn't a snap decision born of pique. It was my meticulously calculated survival plan. I remember the day I told them. We were in the living room, the evening news droning on, a comforting backdrop to their usual indifference. I reached over, silencing the television with a click, and faced them. "I've enlisted," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the earthquake rumbling inside me. "I'll be shipping out for basic training in about 6 weeks." My father let out a short, sharp laugh, brittle as ice. The military. He scoffed, looking at me as if I'd just announced a career as a professional clown. Anya, that's for children with no other options, no prospects. My mother began to cry, but it wasn't tears of fear for my safety, or sorrow at my leaving. It was the stinging, theatrical tears of social shame. What will the neighbors think? She wailed, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. What will I tell the ladies at the golf club? Their reaction was all the confirmation I needed. They saw my choice not as an act of service, but as a final, unforgivable act of social defiance, an insult to their carefully constructed world. Their ultimatum was clear, delivered with icy precision: give up this foolish idea or leave. I chose to leave. They packed a single, cheap suitcase for me, leaving it on the porch, a final, dismissive gesture. As I walked away from that house, I didn't look back. They thought it was a punishment. To me, it was my liberation day. I was finally free to find a family built on merit and camaraderie, not on blood and contempt. Yet, through all those dark, suffocating memories, there was always one point of light, one unwavering anchor in my personal storm. My grandfather, Anya Petrova. A retired Marine Staff Sergeant, a man forged from steel and a quiet, unshakable integrity. He was the only one who truly saw me. While my parents saw a difficult, unfeminine daughter, he saw a warrior spirit, a fierce spark that they refused to acknowledge. He was the one who, in the sprawling fields behind his remote farm, patiently taught me how to hold a rifle, how to sight a target, the weight of the weapon a natural extension of my arm. He didn't tell me stories of princesses and glass slippers. He told me about the mud and the grit of Bellow Wood, the courage under fire at Iwo Jima, about honor, commitment, and the unwavering bond of brotherhood. When my parents would dismiss my requests for a new book, deeming it an unnecessary extravagance, he would slip a crumpled $20 bill into my palm, his gnarled thumb pressing into my skin, and whisper, his voice rough but kind, "Never let anyone tell you you're not smart enough, my girl." His praise was rare, almost as precious as the gold nuggets prospectors sought in the frozen rivers, but when it came, it was pure, untarnished gold. My grandfather's memory, the sound of his voice, his unwavering belief in me, had become my true north. It was the code I lived by through every grueling day of basic training, every lonely night in law school. It was his legacy of honor I carried into that courtroom. And it was his memory that, even now, served as my lighthouse, guiding me toward a truth far darker than I'd ever imagined. His words, "Make me proud," echoed in the quiet of my hotel room. The only man who'd ever championed me was long gone. The victory in the courtroom, however righteous, still felt like a battle won on an isolated island. It was a familiar feeling. The path that had led me to become Captain Anya Petrova, the woman who could defeat her own parents in a court of law, was one I had walked entirely alone. My mind drifted back to the sweltering, humid heat of Fort Richardson, Alaska. Basic training was a culture shock designed to break you down and build you back up in the Army's image. The air hung thick with the scent of pine and sweat. The days blurred into a relentless haze of drill sergeants' voices so loud they seemed to vibrate in your bones, and a physical exhaustion that went deeper than muscle. It was brutal, and for me, it was a sanctuary. While other recruits cried into their bunks at night, homesick and overwhelmed, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in my life, the rules were clear, and they applied to everyone equally. No one cared who your parents were or where you came from. Your worth was measured by tangible things, your ability to scale an obstacle course wall, the precision of your firing group on the rifle range, the perfect hospital corners on your bunk. The Army's harsh, unforgiving meritocracy was a release, a blessed escape from the arbitrary emotional cruelty of my family. I remember one night on fire guard, mopping the barracks floor a little past 3 in the morning. The world was silent except for the rhythmic swish of the mop and the snores of 50 other women. I was tired, my arms ached, and I had to be up for physical training in another 2 hours. And I smiled. It was a genuine, from-the-gut smile. This was hard, miserable work. But it was my work. It was a task I'd been assigned, a responsibility I was fulfilling. It was a truth. No one could dispute it, belittle it, or take it away from me. That feeling propelled me forward. The road from recruit to officer was long and paved with sacrifices no one back home ever saw. While serving enlisted, I used the Army's tuition assistance program to take evening classes at a community college near my unit. I recall countless nights, fueled by cheap coffee and pure will, hunched over a textbook with a small flashlight after a 12-hour day of training exercises. My uniform still smelled of dirt and gunpowder. There were moments of doubt, of profound loneliness. I remember a few of my male comrades made it clear they thought I didn't belong, that I wasn't tough enough. They'd let comments drift loud enough for me to hear, but I'd learned long ago that arguing with people like that was a waste of breath. My grandfather had taught me that actions spoke louder than words. So, I used their disdain as fuel. I didn't argue back. I just ran faster during morning formation. I shot better on the range, earning the expert marksmanship badge they all coveted. I scored higher on every written exam. Gradually, respect began to replace the taunts. It wasn't freely given. It was earned, painstakingly, inch by hard-won inch. When the acceptance letter to officer candidate school, OX, arrived, it felt more like the logical conclusion of a long, calculated campaign than a celebration. It was a silent victory, profoundly personal. The day I stood in my dress uniform and had the gold pins of a second lieutenant placed on my shoulders, I didn't call my parents. I knew they wouldn't understand the journey, the sweat, and the exhaustion that tiny, shiny piece of brass represented. Or worse, they simply wouldn't care. The loneliest years were when the Army sent me to law school, back in Anchorage to attend the University of Alaska Anchorage on their dime. I was in what felt like my home territory, surrounded by familiar streets. Yet I was an island. I lived in a tiny off-campus apartment and kept to myself, focusing solely on my studies. One night, steeped in exhaustion and feeling the weight of my isolation, I was scrolling through online videos, looking for anything to distract myself. I stumbled across a TED talk by a researcher named Brené Brown. I listened as she spoke about vulnerability, about courage and shame. And then she said a sentence that hit me like a lightning strike. Vulnerability is not a weakness. It's our most accurate measure of courage. In that moment, something inside me shifted. All the years I had spent trying to build an armor to hide the wounds my family had inflicted suddenly felt wrong. I saw that those scars weren't something to be ashamed of. They were the source of my strength. The constant feeling of being an outsider was what had forged my independence. The craving for fairness was what had propelled me to pursue justice. The pain of being invisible was what made me determined to see and fight for others. My past wasn't a curse. It was a forge. It had hammered and shaped me into the weapon I had become. That realization was a release. It severed the last invisible tether connecting my self-worth to my parents' approval. The sharp ring of the hotel room phone ripped me from the heavy, suffocating silence that had settled after the verdict. It was a victory, yes, but one that left a bitter taste, a profound exhaustion. My eyes flicked to the caller ID Colonel Volkov, my commanding officer at JAG Corps. I braced myself for the lecture, the inevitable dressing down for stirring up trouble back home. I answered, my voice professional, even. Captain Petrova. Petrova, he said, his voice calm and steady, like a granite wall. He didn't ask for details about the case. He didn't need to. I hear you're causing a ruckus back home. Good for you. There was a brief pause, a beat of unexpected quiet. Just remember, no matter what happens, the Corps has your six. We're proud of you. And then he hung up. I stood there, phone still pressed to my ear, the silence in the room no longer feeling empty. Those 4 simple words, "we're proud of you," were the very ones I'd craved from my own father my entire life. They were a validation he could never give me. Given freely by a man who knew me only through my service and my honor. A slow warmth spread through my chest, pushing back the cold ache of the past. In that moment, I understood. I had lost one family, defined by blood and obligation, but on that lonely path I had found another, one forged in common purpose built on a foundation of honor, respect, and loyalty. And that family, I realized, could not be broken. That warmth from Colonel Volkov's words lingered long after the call ended. A small, steady flame in the cold hotel room. For the first time in my life, a piece of the armor I had so carefully constructed around myself seemed to melt away. "We're proud of you." It was such a simple phrase, yet it was the affirmation I had spent a lifetime yearning for and had finally given up hope of hearing. Perhaps I thought this was the beginning of a new chapter. Perhaps the fight was over. Then my phone rang again. It was an unfamiliar number, an Anchorage area code. I almost let it go to voicemail, but a strange premonition had me answering. Captain Petrova. The voice on the other end was deep, aged, and carried the careful enunciation of a bygone era. "This is Henry Shaw," the man said. "I am your maternal grandfather's attorney, Sergeant Anya Petrova." A shock ran through me. My grandfather had passed away a dozen years ago. "I'm sorry, his attorney?" "His estate was settled long ago." "Yes, mostly," Shaw said, and I heard the rustle of papers. "But there is a very sensitive and urgent matter concerning his will that your parents were never privy to. I believe we need to meet immediately." His tone was not that of a typical lawyer handling a dry administrative task. It was laced with urgency, a tightly controlled anxiety that put me on edge. A prickle of unease began to form in my stomach, replacing the warmth from moments before. Late the following afternoon, I found myself in historic Old Anchorage, a neighborhood of cobblestone streets and beautifully preserved brick buildings. Shaw's law office was on the second floor of one of them, a time capsule of dark wood, leather-bound books, and the sweet, lingering smell of old paper. Henry Shaw was a man who appeared to be in his late 70s, with kind eyes that held a deep weariness. After a polite but brief greeting, he got straight to the point. He slid a thick, cream-colored envelope across his mahogany desk. "Your grandfather was a very astute man, Captain." He began with a sigh. "He knew your parents, particularly their relationship with money. He said they saw the world through dollar signs, and he worried they would use that to control you." He let that sink in before continuing. "So, 12 years ago, he secretly set up a trust fund for you, $50,000. I was stunned into silence. The terms were very specific, Shaw explained. The money was to be released to you only when you reached a significant professional milestone, entirely without their help. He wanted to ensure you had your own foundation, your own way out, should you ever need it." He offered a sad smile. "Becoming a captain and a lawyer in the United States Army JAG Corps. I think it's safe to say you fulfilled the condition with flying colors." The money itself, which he explained had grown to nearly $60,000, was secondary. It was the act. It was a vote of confidence sent from beyond the grave, a final, protective act from the only man who had ever truly tried to protect me. "There's more," Shaw said, his voice softening. He handed me another envelope. This one was old and yellowed with age. "He also left this for you, to be delivered to you along with the trust." My hands trembled slightly as I took it. It was my grandfather's handwriting, strong and certain. I unfolded the single sheet, my heart tightening with each word. He wrote of his pride, of the warrior spirit he always saw in me, even as a little girl. He said he was proud of the woman I was becoming. Then I read the final lines, and the air in the room grew cold. "I'm making some changes to my will, Anya. I intend to leave you half the farm and cannery. I don't trust your parents with it. I don't trust them. Period. Their very nature, you cannot imagine. Be careful." The letter stopped abruptly, as if he had been interrupted mid-sentence. A chilling warning, unfinished in the silent office. Shaw must have seen the color drain from my face. He leaned forward, his expression grave, and finally unburdened himself of something that had haunted him for more than a decade. "Captain Anya," he said, his voice a near whisper. "Just before your grandfather passed away, your mother came to see me. She was agitated, almost frantic. She kept asking if Nikolai could have changed his will without her knowledge. She wanted to know if some alteration could be made to bypass her and your father." He paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "And then he died. The official report said heart failure, but it was too convenient. He'd had a full physical the week before. His doctor told me he was as strong as an ox. His death, at that precise moment, had prevented any changes to the will from being finalized." I stared at him, my mind reeling, connecting dots I never wanted to connect. "And one more thing," Shaw said, his gaze filled with painful reluctance. "I remember your grandfather's garden. He was very proud of it. He grew a lot of foxglove along the back fence." He didn't need to say another word. My legal training, those long nights studying forensics and toxicology, it all crashed down in a wave of horror. Foxglove. That beautiful, bell-shaped flower was the natural source of digoxin, a powerful cardiotoxic drug. In the right dose, it could induce a massive, untraceable heart attack. The world tilted. A version of events, a monstrous, unthinkable scenario, began to construct itself in my mind with terrifying clarity. Motive: a desperate need for inheritance to avoid financial ruin. Opportunity: they were his children, frequently in his home. And means: innocently blooming in his own backyard. My role as a wrong daughter vanished, replaced by the cold, analytical mind of a JAG officer. The civil case in the courtroom downstairs was child's play compared to this. This was a felony. I left Shaw's office with a check I barely noticed and a letter that had just become the most important piece of evidence in the world. The question that had defined my life, why my parents didn't love me, was suddenly overshadowed by a far more terrifying one. Were my parents murderers? Stepping out of Henry Shaw's office, I was no longer the grieving granddaughter. Instead, I was a United States Army captain with a mission. The wrenching ache in my gut had solidified into a cold, unyielding resolve. The question was no longer a haunting phantom. It was a target. I had a hypothesis, and I needed to confirm or deny it with actionable intelligence. Back in the sterile anonymity of my hotel room, there were no tears, no fits of rage. I opened my government-issued laptop and began to formulate a plan of action, the same way I would for any military operation. Mission: confirm or eliminate the murder hypothesis. Primary target: Dr. Elias Thorne, the man who signed the death certificate. Approach: direct action, utilizing the element of surprise, psychological pressure, and the authority of my position. A quote from General George S. Patton I'd committed to memory surfaced in my mind: prepare for the unknown by studying how others in the past have coped with the unforeseeable. I needed to understand the terrain. I spent hours diving deep into Dr. Thorne's background, scanning 12 years of public records for any red flags, sudden changes in financial status, professional troubles, personal instability. I needed to understand the man before I confronted him. He was a piece on the board, and I needed to know his strengths and weaknesses. The next morning, just as the sun was burning off the last tendrils of the Alaskan night, I found his clinic nestled in a quiet suburban medical park, a collection of low, unassuming buildings. He was older now, frail with thinning silver hair and hands that trembled slightly. He looked more like a kindly grandfather than a company conspirator, a fact I filed away for later use. I didn't introduce myself as Anya Petrova. My name was a liability, a personal connection that could be exploited. Instead, I walked into his office, closed the door behind me with a deliberate click, and stood before his desk in my full-class uniform. The uniform was my armor and my weapon. It projected authority, an unyielding wall of officialdom. The polished brass buttons gleamed under the fluorescent lights, reflecting a cold, impersonal power. "Dr. Thorne," I began, my voice even, devoid of any emotion, the words clipped and precise, just like I was trained. "I'm Captain Anya Petrova, JAG Corps. I'm reviewing a number of military-related death certificates for irregularities." His face, already pale from age, went ashen. I placed a copy of my grandfather's death certificate on his desk. I let him look at it. Let the memories and the guilt soak in. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant hum of the building's air conditioning. Then I asked a simple, direct question. My voice was cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "Doctor, is there anything in this report you'd like to amend?" That was all it took. The dam of his denial, maintained for well over a decade, shattered. The old man slumped into his chair and began to sob, his shoulders shaking with the weight of a truth long imprisoned. Through the tears of guilt, the entire story poured out. He told me how my father, Ivan Petrova, had come to him just a few hours after my grandfather's death with a briefcase stuffed with cash and thinly veiled threats about his influential friends on the state medical board. Facing his own financial woes, the doctor had buckled. He'd agreed to falsify the report, listing cardiac arrest as the cause of death and omitting any toxicology tests. But the guilt, he whispered, his voice hoarse, it's been a tumor on my soul. When his confession finally subsided, he fumbled for a key and unlocked a desk drawer. From a dusty file, he retrieved a single sheet of paper. I couldn't bring myself to destroy it, he stammered, sliding it across the desk. It's the original toxicology report. I ran it before your father came to me. I picked it up. There it was, in black and white. Lethal levels of digoxin. It was the first concrete piece of evidence. The first bullet in a war I was now determined to win. With the doctor's sworn testimony and the report in hand, I went to District Attorney Douglas, a tough, uncompromising woman named Catherine Miller. She listened to my story with grim, unwavering focus, her eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, she nodded slowly. The doctor's testimony is a breakthrough, Captain, she conceded, leaning back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the ceiling for a moment. But it's circumstantial. His confession implicates your father in a cover-up, but it doesn't put the poison in their hands. A good defense attorney will paint the doctor as an old man trying to save his own skin, desperate to avoid culpability himself. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine again. I need something that links them directly to the act. A confession, physical evidence, a witness. Without that direct link, a jury will have reason to doubt. I understood. Justice demanded more than just a broken man's confession. I needed an inside asset, my secret weapon. One my parents had created, one they would never see coming. My sister Alina. That night, a little past midnight, I met her at a small all-night diner, a greasy spoon tucked away far from our parents' neighborhood. She walked in defensively, her arms crossed tight over her chest, the neon glow of the sign outside reflecting dimly in her eyes. Before I could even speak, she launched into the words our parents had drilled into her for years. What do you want, Anya? Haven't you caused enough trouble? Coming back here, suing them, humiliating the family. I let her finish. I didn't argue. I simply, quietly, slid a folder across the sticky countertop. Read this, I said softly, my voice barely a whisper above the clatter of plates and the hiss of the coffee machine. Inside were a copy of my grandfather's letter and Dr. Elias Thorne's sworn confession. I watched as her rehearsed anger dissolved, replaced by a ripple of confusion, then dawning horror. Her face sagged, her skin turning a sickly gray under the diner's harsh fluorescent lights. The world our parents had so carefully constructed for her was crumbling right before my eyes. When she finally looked up, the arrogance was gone, replaced by a fearful vulnerability. What? What is this? This was the crucial moment. This wasn't a family conversation. This was a recruitment. I didn't ask. I issued orders. Alina, this isn't about you and me anymore, I said, my voice low and firm, echoing the authority I wore earlier. This is about Grandpa. He was murdered. You can continue living in the comfortable lie they built for you, or you can help me get justice for the only person in this family who ever truly cared about us. I reached into my purse and placed a small device on the table. A digital recorder, no bigger than a keychain. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, I said, my eyes holding hers unwavering, is to go through our father's old records. He keeps everything in boxes in the attic. Financial reports, journals, anything from that time. I need intelligence, Alina, anything that proves how desperate they were. She stared at the recorder as if it were a coiled snake. She trembled, torn between a lifetime of loyalty and a horrifying truth. But deep in her frightened eyes, I saw it. A buried flicker of her own resentment, a spark of conscience. The recruitment was complete. The war had just gained a new, unwilling soldier. The hours I spent waiting for Alina's call felt like the longest stretch of my life. I was holed up in my quiet hotel room, the evidence I'd gathered spread out on the table like a battle plan. Every document, every photograph, every hushed conversation I'd recorded, they were all pieces of a puzzle, but the most crucial intelligence was still missing. I was asking my kid sister, who'd lived a lifetime shielded and protected, to infiltrate enemy territory and confront the ugliest truth imaginable. Each passing minute was a fresh wave of anxiety crashing over me. What if she lost her nerve? What if they came home early? What if this was all some horrible mistake? A phantom enemy I'd conjured from my own pain. As I would learn later, Alina had waited until the hum of our parents' Mercedes faded into the twilight beyond the driveway. They were off to a charity gala, a perfect evening to polish their public image of benevolence and class, while their daughter prepared to dismantle that very facade. The irony was suffocating, with her heart hammering against her ribs, so hard she could feel it thrumming in her throat. She made her way upstairs to the attic. The stairs groaned in protest as she ascended into that dark, dusty space holding all the forgotten history of our family. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, decaying paper, and mothballs, the smell of buried secrets. A single overhead bulb cast long, dancing shadows across stacks of old furniture and forgotten childhood toys. Her mission objective was a row of cardboard file boxes leaning against the far wall, neatly labeled by year. Old finances, the labels declared. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back. It felt like a betrayal, a sacred invasion. Our mother's voice echoed in her mind, a ghostly whisper chiding her for being ungrateful, for being too nosy. But then another image pushed it aside, my grandfather's kindly, crinkling eyes. The memory of his warmth, his quiet strength. This wasn't for her. This was for him. She was his soldier now, and she had a mission to complete. She started with the box labeled 2012. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, she found exactly what I had hoped for and what she had dreaded. It wasn't a record of wealth and success. It was a paper trail of desperation, stacks upon stacks of bank statements with shockingly low balances, a flurry of letters from creditors, their language growing harsher with each successive page. Final notice, overdue. There were documents outlining failed investments and a second mortgage on their house teetering on the brink of foreclosure. The lavish life Alina had always known, the European trips, the designer clothes, the effortless comfort, it had all been a lie. A carefully constructed illusion swaying on the edge of collapse. The motive for murder was no longer a vague hypothesis. It was stark, cold, and calculated, laid out in black and white. They didn't just want my grandfather's inheritance. They needed it to survive, to maintain a veneer more vital to them than life itself. Greed wasn't just a character flaw. It was a desperate, cornered beast. Digging deeper, near the bottom of the box, her fingers brushed against something that didn't belong. It wasn't a financial record. It was a small, leather-bound notebook, the kind our mother always used for her gardening notes. Alina almost dismissed it, but a cold premonition made her open it. The first few pages were exactly what she expected: notes on pruning roses, the best fertilizer for hydrangeas. Our mother's elegant, looping handwriting filled the pages. But then she turned to the section on foxglove. The handwriting changed. It was smaller, more meticulous, chillingly precise. It described in gruesome detail the process of extracting the plant's potent chemical, digoxin. It recorded the exact dosage needed to induce cardiac arrest in a man of our grandfather's age and weight. It even noted how the symptoms could be easily mistaken for natural causes by an overworked or careless physician. It was a cold, clinical recipe for murder. Alina felt a wave of nausea. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. She flipped to the very last page. There, a final entry dated the very day our grandfather had passed, written in our mother's hand: mission accomplished. Nikolai is at peace. Now we can begin again. The world reeled around her. This wasn't a gardener's diary. It was a monster's journal. A cold-blooded killer's confession. Alina stumbled out of the attic, gasping for air. The notebook and a handful of bank statements clutched to her chest. She ran from the house as if it were burning, her heart threatening to explode. She met me at our designated rendezvous point, a secluded corner of a local park, just as the last hints of daylight faded into dusk. She didn't say a word. She just placed the evidence on the picnic table between us. I stared at the notebook, at our mother's familiar, beautiful handwriting detailing the murder of her own father. My last doubts, The final flicker of hope that this was all just some terrible misunderstanding evaporated like mist in the Alaskan sun. A cold spread through me that had nothing to do with the night air. These people weren't my parents. Not anymore. They were predators in civilian clothes, and we had uncovered their hunting ground. I looked up at Alina. She was trembling from head to toe, but her eyes held a new fire, a steely glint I'd never seen before. The sheltered, spoiled girl was gone. In her place was a woman who had stared into the abyss and hadn't turned away. "What do we do now?" she whispered, her voice raw and broken. I reached across the table and took her hand. It was ice cold, but she squeezed back with surprising strength. "We do the right thing," I said, my voice steady and clear, like a command. "We end this. Together, we walked to my car." As I started the engine and pulled out onto the road, heading toward the district attorney's office, I knew we had crossed a point of no return. We had chosen justice over blood. We had chosen honor over family, and there was no going back now.